Clara Whitmore slammed $35 onto the auctioneer's table with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. Not from fear, but from something fiercer than fear, and every man in that barn turned to stare at her like she'd lost her mind. The horse behind the gate was black as a winter midnight, too thin, too quiet, carrying a price tag that told the whole world she wasn't worth saving. Clara didn't flinch. She looked straight at the animal nobody wanted and said, "I'll take her." The laughter that followed her out of that auction barn would fuel the next 6 years of her life. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city or state you're watching from. We want to see just how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what Clara Whitmore did with that $35 horse is going to stay with you for a long, long time. The autumn of 1881 came in cold and mean across Red Hollow Valley, the way it always did, with a wind that bit through wool coats and rattled barn doors on their hinges, and reminded every rancher in Montana Territory that winter didn't wait for anybody to be ready. The auction yard outside town filled up before sunrise. Men arrived in groups, stamping their boots against the frost-hardened ground, breathing clouds into the air, trading gossip about bloodlines and stud fees, and which ranchers had hit hard times and which ones were buying. Horses moved through the holding pens in a stream of muscle and noise. Big stallions with their heads high, young mares still skittish from the trailer ride animals whose pedigrees had been written down in leather-bound ledgers going back 3 and 4 generations. Money moved fast at the Red Hollow Autumn Auction. It always did. William Carter arrived at 7:30 in a coat that cost more than most families in the valley earned in a month. He was 51 years old, barrel-chested, with a jaw like a fence post, and eyes the pale gray color of an overcast sky. He owned 1,200 acres on the eastern ridge, 3 prize stallions, whose names were known as far away as Denver, and a reputation for never being wrong about a horse. Men stepped aside when William Carter walked through a crowd. Not because they were afraid of him, though some of them were, but because he carried his certainty like a physical thing, something solid you could feel when he moved past you. He stopped at the pen holding the black mare and looked at her for about 4 seconds. "Nothing there," he said to no one in particular. "Move on." His 2 ranch hands followed him without looking back. The mare stood at the far corner of the pen, apart from the other horses. She was small, noticeably smaller than the other mares her age. Her coat was rough from a summer that hadn't fed her right. Her ribs showed just slightly the way ribs do on a horse that's been worked without enough to eat. Her legs were narrow. Her head hung at a quiet, watchful angle. She wasn't moving around the way the other horses moved. She wasn't pushing against the fence or tossing her head or calling out. She just stood there, dark and still, watching everything around her with eyes that caught the early morning light, and held it. The price tag on her pen said $35. Every other horse in that auction was going for $200 minimum. Some would go for $1,000. William Carter's prize yearling, the one people had been talking about for 3 months, was expected to top $1,500 before the bidding was done. $35 was an insult dressed up as a price. It was the auction yard's way of saying, "We'll take whatever we can get." It was a number that told everybody who walked past that this animal had already been written off, already decided against, already given up on, before the morning was half finished. Clara Whitmore arrived at the auction yard at 8:15, which meant she'd been on the road since before 5 in the morning. She drove a wagon that had seen better decades, pulled by a roan gelding named Biscuit, who had more heart than speed. She wore her brown coat with the collar turned up, her dark hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat, and she carried herself the way women who've lived alone on working ranches carry themselves, not apologetically, not loudly, just forward. 1 foot in front of the other, eyes open, mind already on the list of things that needed doing. She was 35 years old. She had been widowed at 32 when Thomas Whitmore's horse threw him on a rocky hillside in a rainstorm and he didn't get up again. She had inherited his ranch, the small one on the western side of the valley, 46 acres, with a creek that ran low in summer, a barn that needed its east wall rebuilt, and enough debt attached to it to keep her awake most nights. People in Red Hollow Valley knew Clara Whitmore. They'd watched her keep that ranch running for 3 years by herself, which was something most of them privately thought she wouldn't manage. They respected her work ethic in the way people respect something they find surprising, with a kind of admiring disbelief, like they're waiting for the thing to end. A woman alone on 46 acres in Montana Territory in 1881 was doing something that didn't fit the shape of what was normal, and people had a hard time not commenting on things that didn't fit. She had come to the auction looking for a second working horse. Biscuit was aging. She needed something that could take over fence work and the heavier hauling before next spring. She had $90 in her coat pocket, which was most of what she had, and she'd already told herself she was going to be practical about this. No risks. Something solid and sound and within her means. She walked the pens methodically the way Thomas had taught her, checking legs first, then back, then teeth, watching how the animal moved in the small space, listening to its breathing. She'd looked at 4 horses and passed on all of them by the time she reached the far pen. She almost walked past the black mare without stopping. It was the eyes that made her pause. Later, she would have trouble explaining it to people who asked. It wasn't that the mare was looking at her specifically. It wasn't some moment of connection the way people sometimes romanticized things in stories. It was simpler and stranger than that. The mare was watching the activity around her, the men moving past the other horses, the auction workers with their clipboards, with an attention that was different from fear. Most horses in a situation like that were either agitated or checked out. This one was watching, like she was learning, like she was filing everything away. Clara stopped. She stood at the fence for 2 minutes without moving, just watching the mare the way the mare was watching everything else. "She's not worth your time." Clara turned. A man she half recognized from somewhere, one of Carter's ranch hands, she thought was leaning against the post of the neighboring pen, working a piece of straw between his teeth. "I didn't ask," Clara said. He shrugged. "Saving you from wasting your morning. Mare's got no breeding, no papers. That coat'll never come right, you can tell just by looking. She's been underfed, too long bones, too narrow. She'll give you nothing." Clara turned back to the mare. "What's her story?" she asked. "Don't know that she has one worth telling. Came in with a lot from a broke-up homestead over past Billings. Owner died, family sold off everything, nobody knew much about where the horses came from. She's young, 3, maybe 3.5. That's about all anybody knows." Clara opened the gate and walked into the pen. This was the moment that first caught people's attention. Women did not generally walk into the holding pens at the Red Hollow auction. It wasn't a rule anybody had written down. It was just one of those things that was understood the way a lot of things in 1881 were understood. Clara walked in anyway. She moved slowly, no sudden actions, letting the mare track her approach. The horse didn't back away. She turned to face Clara directly. Nostrils working, head up, but not high. Curious, not alarmed. Clara ran her hand along the mare's neck. She checked the legs the way Thomas had taught her, pressing with her thumbs along the tendons, feeling for heat or thickening. She looked at the hooves. She opened the mare's mouth gently and looked at her teeth. Then she stood back and just looked at her for another long moment. The ranch hand outside the fence said, "Lady, I'm telling you." "I heard you the first time," Clara said. She came out of the pen, latched the gate, and walked toward the auction office to register her number. She hadn't decided yet, but she was thinking. The bidding for the black mare lot, 47, was scheduled for mid-morning after the main horses had moved through. By the time the auctioneer called the number, most of the serious buyers had already made their purchases and were standing in loose groups, drinking coffee and talking. A few people drifted over out of curiosity, the way people always drifted toward the oddities at the end of an auction, not to buy, just to watch. "Lot number 47. The auctioneer called out, his voice, carrying that particular rhythm all auctioneers had, fast and rhythmic, almost musical. Black mare, 3 to 4 years old, no registered bloodline, healthy enough sound on all 4 legs. Starting bid $35. Do I hear 35? Silence. Not the thinking kind of silence. The already decided kind. William Carter, standing 20 feet away with a cup of coffee in his hand, said loudly enough for half the barn to hear, "$35? That horse isn't worth the saddle on her back." He said it to the man beside him, but pitched his voice to carry the way men who are used to holding rooms do without thinking about it. "Buy her for 35, spend 400 feeding her through the winter, and what do you have? A $35 horse that cost you 400. The men around him laughed. "Do I hear 35? The auctioneer tried again with less conviction this time. Clara raised her bidding card. The shift in the room was immediate and physical. Clara felt the way attention moved, the way conversation stopped, the way eyes turned. She kept her own eyes on the auctioneer and her card in the air. $35 we have, $35 from the lady in the brown coat. Do I hear $40 anywhere? More silence, the waiting kind. Going once at 35, going twice. You just bought yourself 6 years of disappointment, William Carter said, and his voice wasn't loud. Now it was almost conversational, but the barn was quiet enough that everyone heard it. Clara lowered her card and turned to look at him. William Carter was watching her with that expression men sometimes wore, not quite contempt, but something adjacent to it, something that said, "I don't need to be cruel because I'm simply correct, and you'll understand that eventually." "I bought something," Clara said, "that nobody else bothered to look at." "Looking at her is exactly what the rest of us did," he said. "That's how we knew not to buy her." A few people laughed again, quieter this time. "Sold," the auctioneer said with something that sounded like relief, to the lady in the brown coat. $35. Clara walked to the office to settle the payment, and she was aware the whole way of the sound of people talking behind her, the particular texture of conversation that meant she was the subject of it. She kept her chin level and her steps even, and she did not let herself think about what she was doing until she was outside in the cold air with the paperwork in her hand. Then, she stood for a moment alone and looked at what she'd written her name to. $35. No registered bloodline. No papers. No certainty about anything, except that she'd seen something in that mare that she couldn't name and couldn't walk away from. She took a breath of cold Montana air and walked back toward the holding pen. The mare was standing exactly where Clara had left her, still and watchful, that quality of attention focused outward at everything around her. "All right," Clara said quietly, more to herself than to the horse. "Let's go figure out what you're made of." She'd brought a lead rope. She attached it to the mare's halter and opened the gate, and the mare walked out with her without any resistance, without the sideways spooking or foot planting that would have been understandable given the noise and crowd around them. Just walked out steady and quiet, following Clara through the auction yard toward where Biscuit and the wagon waited. They were halfway across the yard when she heard footsteps behind her and turned. It was a man she didn't recognize, tall, lean, somewhere around 40, with a working man's hands and a rancher's squint from years of outdoor light. He had the kind of face that had been weathered enough to be interesting, with dark eyes that were looking at the mare with an expression Clara recognized because she'd just felt it herself. "That your horse?" he asked. "Just bought her," Clara said. "Why?" He looked at the mare for another moment. "I watched you in the pen with her. You were checking the joints." "I was." "Find anything?" "Nothing bad," Clara said. "Why are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment. "Name's Elias Cade. I've got the ranch about 4 miles past yours on the North Road. We haven't met proper, but I know who you are." He paused. "I know who she is too. Or I think I might." Clara felt something go still in her chest. "What do you mean?" "The homestead that broke up near Billings," he said. "The one this lot came from. I knew the man who owned it. Old fellow named Donahue. Bred horses for 30 years. Lost his place to bad debt, got sick the last couple years, didn't have anyone left to manage the animals right. The horses weren't fed the way they should have been." He looked at the mare again. But before all that went wrong, Donahue had one thing he wouldn't talk about. A breeding line he'd been developing for 20 years. Kept it quiet because he didn't want people buying his animals out from under him before they were ready. Clara looked at the mare. The mare was watching a group of men across the yard with that same focused, patient attention. "You think this is one of his line?" Clara asked. "I think she might be," Elias said. "I'm not certain. I can't prove it, but I watched Donahue's horses work years back before things went bad for him. There was something different about them. The way they moved, the way they thought." He paused. "She's got that same quality, that stillness. Donahue used to say a horse that's always moving is using up what it should be saving." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Why didn't you bid on her yourself?" He met her eyes. "I didn't have the $35 to spare today, and I figured if you were the one willing to walk into the pen and check her legs while Carter was making speeches, you were the one who ought to have her." He paused again. "I'm just telling you what I know, in case it helps you know what you've got." Clara looked at the mare. The mare looked back at her. "It helps," Clara said. Elias Cade nodded once and walked away back into the crowd. Clara stood with the lead rope in her hand for another moment, turning over what he'd said. 20 years of careful breeding that nobody knew about. A man who'd kept his work quiet because he loved it more than he wanted credit for it. A line of horses that thought before they moved. And $35. She clicked her tongue softly and led the mare toward the wagon. The ride home took an hour and a half. The mare Clara was already calling her shadow in her head, though she hadn't said it out loud yet, walked well behind the wagon, not pulling at the rope, not lagging, just moving steadily through the cold morning, with the same economy of motion Clara had noticed in the pen. Biscuit, for his part, was skeptical. He kept glancing back with one eye. The mare ignored him with a dignity that Clara found quietly funny. When they came up over the last ridge and the ranch came into view, the small house, the barn with the east wall that still needed work, the two fields divided by a split-rail fence. Clara let herself look at it the way she sometimes did when she'd been away taking it in fresh. It wasn't much. She knew it wasn't much. But it was hers, and she'd kept it running, and there was something in that fact she hadn't let herself surrender to grief. She brought the wagon through the gate and stopped near the barn. Unhitched Biscuit first got him settled in his stall. Then she led Shadow in through the far end of the barn, into the clean stall she'd prepared that morning before she left. She took off the lead rope and stepped back and let the mare explore the space. Shadow walked the stall perimeter slowly, nose working, taking in everything, the smell of the hay, the boards, the lingering smell of the other horse. Then she stopped in the center, turned once, and looked at Clara. "I know," Clara said. "It's not much." The mare snorted softly and bent to the hay. Clara leaned against the stall door and watched her for a long time in the quiet of the barn, listening to the wind outside and the sound of the horse eating, and the distant creak of the barn's damaged wall. She'd spent $35 she shouldn't have. She'd walked into a pen in front of a crowd of men who thought she didn't belong there. She'd bought an animal with no papers and no pedigree, and nothing to recommend her but a quality of attention that Clara could feel but not explain. In the morning, people would ask her what she'd bought, and she would tell them, and they would shake their heads, and word would get back to William Carter, who would probably laugh again. She already knew all of that. She also knew what she'd felt when she'd stood in that pen with the mare, when she'd run her hands along the legs and felt no heat, felt no weakness, felt nothing but sound and strong and quietly waiting. Thomas used to say some things take time to prove themselves. The mistake is walking away before they get the chance. She turned off the barn lamp and walked out into the cold night. Behind her in the stall, Shadow stood in the darkness and waited. She had been waiting a long time already. She was good at it. The next morning, Clara was up before light. She'd slept 3 hours, which was her usual these days. There was always something pulling her back awake, a list running in her head, a worry about water levels in the creek, a calculation about hay stores that didn't add up right. She'd learned not to fight it. She made coffee, stood at the window for a few minutes, watching the dark begin to come apart at the edges, then pulled on her coat and went out to the barn. Shadow was awake. Of course she was. Clara had a feeling this horse was almost always awake. She stood at the stall door with her coffee and watched the mare in the gray morning light. And the mare watched her back, and for a few minutes they just did. They took stock of each other. "I'm going to be straight with you," Clara said finally. "I don't entirely know what I'm doing here. I've got a plan for this ranch that's been built around a lot of things going right that haven't all gone right yet. I can't afford a mistake." She paused. "But I don't think you are one." The mare shifted her weight. "I'm going to need you to work with me on this," Clara said. "I'm going to need you to show me what you've got, and I'm going to need you to trust me a little while I figure out how to help you do that. Can you do that?" It was a ridiculous thing to say to a horse. She knew it. Thomas would have laughed at her. She said it anyway. Shadow blinked once, slow and deliberate, and went back to the hay. Clara decided to take that as yes. She started that morning with the basics working Shadow in the small paddock behind the barn, just walking her first, watching the way she moved without the tension and noise of the auction yard around her. It took about 20 minutes before Clara started to understand what she was looking at. The mare moved differently than other horses. There was an efficiency to it that was almost mathematical. No wasted motion, no excess energy burned on steps that didn't need to be as large or as fast as other horses made them. She listened with her whole body, not just her ears. When Clara changed direction, she felt it half a second before the rope told her, reading it off Clara's weight and the slight shift in her shoulders. By the end of the first hour, Clara was standing in the middle of the paddock with her arms at her sides, not holding the lead rope, just standing, and the mare was circling her at a steady walk, maintaining the distance between them with perfect consistency because Clara had asked her to. Nobody had taught this horse that. Clara was certain of it. She'd just laid out the logic of the thing: move out, keep distance, follow the circle in the way she moved, and directed the way Thomas had taught her to communicate, and the mare had understood it like she was reading a sentence in a language she already knew. Clara didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said quietly to no one, "Well," because there weren't more words than that just then. She worked the mare an hour every morning before the rest of the ranch work started. Feed at first light, then the paddock work, then the fence repairs, and the hay, and the 100 other things that kept her days full from sunup to past dark. She told no one what she was doing. She didn't need anyone's opinion on her $35 horse, and she certainly didn't need the opinions that were already circulating around town. At the feed store 3 days after the auction, Bill Hamlin, who ran the place and kept track of everybody's business, as a point of personal pride, watched Clara loading sacks onto her wagon and said, "Here you bought yourself the charity lot at the auction." "I bought a horse," Clara said. "A $35 horse," he said. And there was that particular tone men used when they thought they were being generous by stating things plainly. "People are talking about it." "People were talking the day before too," Clara said. "Doesn't change the hay the horse needs." He laughed, not unkindly, but with that edge of pity that was worse than cruelty in some ways. "Clara, you've got enough on your plate without a project animal. That ranch of yours is mine," she said. "And the horse is mine, and the hay is going on my wagon." She smiled at him, even and steady. "I appreciate the concern. I'll see you next week." She drove home with the supplies and didn't let herself be angry about it, because anger was expensive and she had too many other things to spend her energy on. But she filed it away. She had a habit of filing things away, the things people said, the things they assumed, the things they decided about her without asking. She didn't carry them around. She just remembered them. And she worked the mare. 2 weeks in, she started adding obstacles to the paddock work: a wooden frame, a rope strung between posts, a barrel she could move to different positions. She wanted to see how Shadow handled the unexpected. Most horses had some threshold for novelty, some point past which the unfamiliar became alarming. Shadow didn't seem to have that threshold, or if she did, Clara hadn't found it yet. She moved around the obstacle course with her ears rotating, taking in information, making decisions that looked effortless but couldn't be had to be the product of something of a quality of mind that processed and adapted in the fraction of a second between seeing a thing and responding to it. "She thinks," Clara wrote in the notebook she kept on the barn shelf. "She doesn't just react, she thinks." A month after the auction, she rode Shadow for the first time. She'd taken it slow groundwork driving with long lines, sacking out with the saddle blanket, and then the saddle, until none of it was alarming. Shadow accepted everything with that watchful patience, not resigned, not broken patient, in the way a creature is patient when it is conserving itself for something it understands is coming. The first ride was a revelation. The mare moved under Clara like something that had been waiting to do exactly this. The communication between them. Clara's weight, her legs, the subtle shift of her hands, wasn't something Clara had to work at. It was immediate. Like the mare could read the intention before the signal fully formed and had already answered it. Clara rode in the backfield for 2 hours. She was laughing by the end of it, not loudly, not the kind of laughing you'd show someone, but the private kind. The kind that comes up from the chest when something is better than you were ready for. She unsaddled Shadow and stood with her in the field in the late afternoon light, and she said, "You're not what anyone thinks you are you?" The mare turned her head and looked at her, and Clara looked back. And the thing that had been building between them for a month, the slow accumulation of mornings and hours, and the wordless conversation of a woman and a horse figuring each other out, settled into something solid. The ranch didn't know it yet. The valley didn't know it yet. William Carter certainly didn't know it. But in that field, in that light, Clara Whitmore and a black mare nobody had wanted for $35 had made themselves a promise. They were going to show them all. Not because of the laughter. Not because of the pity at the feed store. Not because of the man who had said she'd bought herself 6 years of disappointment. Because Thomas had taught her something she'd never been able to let go of. The thing worth doing is the thing everybody else already quit on. The cold came down hard that winter, the way Montana winters did, serious and deliberate without apology. The ranch was hard to keep in those months. The water had to be broken on the troughs twice a day. The barn needed extra insulation packed into the east wall, which meant she finally had to fix what she'd been putting off fixing, and she did it herself over 3 days in December, hands raw from cold and work talking to Shadow through the wall while she worked, because talking helped her think. Shadow spent those months in the barn, and Clara brought her out when the cold broke enough to be safe working her in the paddock with breath clouding between them. The mare gained weight steadily. The rough coat began to change. It was slow, the way real change was always slow, but it was unmistakable if you knew how to look. By February, Elias Cade came by. He knocked at the barn door on a Sunday morning, which was when Clara was doing her longer training session. She pulled open the big door and found him standing there with snow on his hat and a look on his face that was careful and curious in equal parts. "Heard you've been working with her," he said. "Every morning," Clara said. He gestured toward the paddock. "Can I watch?" She considered him for a moment. He'd been straight with her at the auction. He'd told her what he knew and walked away. She appreciated that no performance in it, no request for credit. "Come on then," she said. She worked Shadow for 40 minutes, while Elias stood at the fence, arms crossed, watching without speaking. When she brought the mare in, he unfolded himself from the fence and walked over and looked at Shadow in the way Clara recognized, that close, complete attention that meant something real was being evaluated. "She's gained muscle," he said. "She has. That coat's coming in right." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She moves like what I remember." Clara looked at him. Donahue's line, "I can't prove it," he said. "I've said that. But what I saw on that man's ranch, the best of what he was building, it moved like that. Efficient, economical. Like every step is the right one, and no step is extra." Clara looked at Shadow. "What happened to the rest of his horses?" she asked. "Sold off before I could get there," he said. "Family needed the money fast. Some of them went to good places, I think. Some of them—" He stopped. "You were the only one at the auction who looked twice at her." "You would have," Clara said. "I would have," he agreed. "But I didn't have the $35. A pause. "I'm glad you did." She looked at him for a moment, at the weathered face, and the careful eyes, and the manner of a man who said what he meant and nothing extra. "You know anything about bloodline development?" she asked. He raised an eyebrow. Some? Why? Because I'm going to need advice, she said, and I'd rather get it from somebody who knows what they're talking about and doesn't have anything to prove. He was quiet for a moment. That's about the most straightforward request I've had in some time, he said. I'm a busy woman, Clara said. I don't have time to be indirect. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the edge of one, and she took note of it. All right, he said. I know some things. I'll tell you what I know. He left an hour later, and Clara went back to her work, and Shadow stood in the barn watching the door he'd gone out of with that expression that might have been thoughtfulness, or might have been nothing at all, but which Clara had started to believe was the former. He's decent, Clara told her. The mare went back to the hay. Spring came. The valley opened up again, and with it came the whispers that Clara Whitmore's strange auction horse was something nobody had quite expected. She hadn't said anything. She hadn't made any announcements. She'd just worked. But people talked anyway, and people had eyes, and some of them had started to notice things they couldn't fully explain away. At the church social in April, Mary Hollis, whose husband ran cattle on the southern end of the valley, sat down beside Clara and said in the particular way women talked when they were telling you something they'd heard from their husbands. Robert says that Carter boy rode past your place last week and watched your horse work in the field. Clara kept her face easy. Is that right? Said he couldn't figure out what he was seeing. Mary paused. Said the way she moved wasn't like other horses. Clara folded her hands in her lap. She's a good horse, she said. She works hard. You didn't pay much for her, Mary said. And it wasn't a challenge. Mary wasn't built for challenges. It was just the thing everyone kept coming back to, the thing that didn't fit the detail that caught in people's minds. No, Clara said. I didn't. She picked up her coffee cup and didn't say anything else about it, and Mary, after a moment, moved on to other topics. But Clara sat with it for the rest of the afternoon. The image of one of Carter's hands stopped on the road watching Shadow work in the field. Carter sending someone past to look. Carter, who had stood in that barn and declared there was nothing worth seeing. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She felt something quieter, something more like certainty. The thing about Red Hollow Valley was that it had a long memory and a short patience. It would decide what something was worth based on the first impression it made, and changing that decision required something large and undeniable. Not argument, not explanation. Something the valley couldn't look away from. She was going to give it that. She just needed time. And Shadow steady patient, impossible. Shadow had already shown her that time was not something she needed to fear. The first time someone offered Clara money for Shadow, it was only 7 months after the auction. She hadn't been expecting it. She'd been in the middle of a fence repair on the north side of the property. Her hands wrapped around wire cutters when she heard hooves on the road, and looked up to find a man she didn't recognize pulling his horse to a stop and looking at Shadow in the adjacent field. Shadow was doing what she did most mornings when Clara had finished working her and let her loose in the field, moving at her own pace, following some internal logic that looked like wandering, but wasn't. Every circuit she made of that field was slightly different, slightly deliberate. Clara had stopped trying to explain it and started just watching it. The stranger watched it too for a long time without saying anything. Then he called over the fence, "That your horse?" "She is," Clara said, without stopping work on the wire. "She for sale?" "No." He sat there another moment. "I'll give you 120 for her." Clara set down the wire cutters and looked at him properly. He was well dressed, not from the valley, a buyer of some kind she guessed, or a man who worked for one. The kind of man whose job was to find things worth more than people were asking. "She's not for sale," Clara said again. "Not for 120, not for more." He looked at Shadow another moment, then looked back at Clara with the expression of a man recalculating something. "You know what you've got there?" "I'm starting to," Clara said, and picked the wire cutters back up. He left without another word, and Clara went back to the fence, and she did not let herself think too hard about the fact that someone who found horses for a living had stopped on that road and offered her more than 3 times what she'd paid 7 months in, when the mare still wasn't fully what she was going to be. She filed that away too. She was getting good at filing things. Elias Cade came by twice a week through that spring, and gradually, without either of them making a decision about it, the visits extended past what they needed to be. He would come to look at Shadow, which was the reason, and then he would end up staying for coffee, which became a second reason, and then he would find something on the property that needed an extra set of hands, which became a third. And Clara let it happen because Elias was useful and direct, and did not treat her ranch like something temporary. He did not treat her like something temporary either, which she noticed more than she let herself acknowledge. One afternoon in May, they were sitting on the fence watching Shadow work the field. Clara ran her through the circuit once a day. Now, a loose routine that was half training and half something she couldn't name. And Elias said without preamble, "You need to think about what you're going to do with her." "I think about it every day," Clara said. "I mean seriously," he said. "Not just the work. The future. What you want the work to build toward." Clara was quiet for a moment. She had been thinking about this in the way she thought about most things quietly in the back of her mind, while her hands were doing something else. She'd been reading everything she could find about horse breeding, borrowing books from the county library, asking Elias questions, and then verifying his answers against what she read, not because she didn't trust him, but because she trusted herself more when she understood the why behind a thing. "I want to breed her," Clara said finally, carefully, not right away. "I want her to be fully herself first, not rushed, not pushed. And then I want to find out what she passes on." Elias nodded slowly. "That's the right answer." "You were going to tell me that anyway," she said, "whether I said the right thing or not." "Probably," he agreed. "But I'm glad you got there yourself." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because it means you'll do it right," he said. "People who do things because someone told them to always quit when it gets hard. People who do things because they understood it themselves." He stopped. "They don't quit." Clara turned back to Shadow in the field. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the 3 years since the winters and the debt and the fence posts, and the nights when the arithmetic of keeping the ranch going didn't work no matter how many times she ran it. She thought about a cold morning in October, with $35 in her coat pocket, and a horse nobody else stopped to look at. "No," she said quietly. "They don't." What she hadn't told Elias, what she hadn't told anyone, was that she'd already been approached twice more since the first stranger on the road. A letter had come in March from a livestock broker in Billings offering $200, which was more than she made in 3 good months from the ranch. She'd written back 2 words, "not selling." A man from the Territorial Agricultural Office had stopped by in April politely with a great deal of professional language around what amounted to the same offer. She'd given him coffee and sent him back the way he'd come. The offers were telling her something important. They were telling her that she hadn't imagined what she'd seen in that auction pen. She hadn't invented it or wanted it so badly she'd made it real in her mind. Other people, people whose job was to find value before other people found it, were seeing it too. Were willing to pay for it. The thing she had was real, which meant the thing she did with it mattered enormously, and she was not going to hurry it, and she was not going to sell it, and she was not going to let anyone, not a broker in Billings, not the agricultural office, not William Carter, not the well-meaning concern of Bill Hamlin at the feed store, talk her into treating it as anything less than what it was. Summer came in hard and hot that year, and Clara worked from before sunrise to after dark the way she always did, and Shadow worked with her. Not on the ranch, Clara kept the training separate from the labor, kept that distinction clear, because she understood by now that what Shadow was being built toward wasn't fence work, and hauling, that those weren't the jobs that would prove what she was, but every morning the paddock. Every day something new to understand, some new conversation between woman and horse conducted in pressure and release and patience. Elias brought a retired veterinarian named Samuel Hayes to the ranch in July. He arrived unannounced with Elias, which Clara was not entirely pleased about, and she said so quietly to Elias while Hayes was tying his horse at the post. "He's the best eye for a horse I've ever known," Elias said quietly back. "And he's not going to tell anybody anything. I trust him." "I don't know him," Clara said. "That's why I brought him," he said. "So you can." She gave Elias a long look that said she was filing this instance of presumption away for later. And then she walked over to Samuel Hayes and shook his hand. Hayes was 60 or so, with a doctor's habit of observation, looking at everything, first speaking second. He watched Shadow from the fence for a solid 10 minutes without saying a word while Clara and Elias stood back and let him do it. Then he said, "Bring her out." Clara brought Shadow into the paddock and put her through a shortened version of the morning routine. Hayes watched every moment of it, watched the way the mare's joints moved, watched her footfall pattern, watched the muscle engagement in her haunches and shoulders, watched the way she tracked Clara's movement and responded to it. When it was done, he came into the paddock and did what Clara had done at the auction, but in greater detail, a thorough professional assessment that covered things Clara didn't have the vocabulary for, yet working through everything with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd done this 10,000 times and was no longer impressed by much. When he finished, he stood back and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you get this horse?" Clara told him. "The auction. $35. No papers. The lot from the broken-up homestead." Hayes listened and said nothing until she'd finished, and then he turned and looked at Shadow again, who was standing in the paddock watching him in return with complete equanimity. "I've been in this work for 37 years, Hayes said. "I want you to hear what I'm about to say clearly because I don't say things like this lightly." Clara waited. "This horse has a quality of joint structure that I have seen perhaps a dozen times in my career. Perfect, not good, perfect. She has an intelligence of movement that cannot be trained into an animal only bred. And that intelligence," he paused, choosing his words, "passes on. That's how lineages are built, not on speed alone or size or beauty, on the qualities that replicate. This horse's qualities will replicate." He turned to look at Clara directly. "Don't rush her. Don't breed her young. Don't let anyone push you into moving before she's ready. Give her time to fully develop and then breed with the same care you've brought to everything else you've done here." He glanced around the ranch, the repaired east wall of the barn, the neat fence lines, the organized order of a place being kept up by someone who cared and worked and didn't stop. "You've got a good eye," he said, "better than most of the men who were at that auction." "They weren't looking," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "They weren't." He left without fanfare the way he'd arrived. Elias watched him go, and then turned to Clara, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before, something that was more than the satisfaction of being right about a horse. "I told you," he said. "You told me you thought," she said. "Now we know." He looked at her for a moment. "What are you going to do?" Clara looked at Shadow standing in the paddock, still unhurried present. "Exactly what I was already doing," she said, just with more certainty. That August, William Carter did something Clara hadn't expected. He came to her ranch, not with a reason she could argue against. He came, she learned later, under the pretense of looking at her northern fence line, which bordered a piece of land he'd been trying to acquire for 2 years. But the fence was not why he stayed for 20 minutes at the paddock gate watching Shadow. Clara was in the barn when he arrived, and she came out to find him there, standing with his hands on the top rail. And she stopped when she saw him and just looked at the back of him for a moment. He turned when he heard her footsteps. He had the expression of a man who had not planned to be caught at something. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Carter." She stopped a few feet away from him. "Can I help you with something?" He looked back at Shadow. "That's the horse from the auction." "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "She looks different than she did." "Animals tend to do that," Clara said, "when someone takes care of them." He turned his head at that, not quite stung, but aware of the edge in it. He looked at her with those pale gray eyes, and something passed across his face that might have been the very beginning of reassessment. "I heard Hayes came out here," he said. Clara didn't ask how he'd heard. Information in Red Hollow Valley moved the way water moved through every crack and along every low-lying path. "He did," she said. "What did he say?" She looked at Carter steadily. This was the man who had stood in that auction barn and told everyone within earshot that she'd bought herself 6 years of disappointment. This was the man whose laugh had followed her out the door. "He said what I already knew," she said, "that she's exceptional." Carter looked back at the horse. Shadow was moving along the far fence at her own pace, that characteristic economy of motion that caught your eye and held it if you knew how to look. "She moves well," he said finally, which was the most concession she'd heard from him about anything. "Yes," Clara said. "She does." Another pause, the kind of silence that had weight in it. "I was wrong about her," Carter said. He didn't look at Clara when he said it. He kept his eyes on the horse. "At the auction, I was wrong." Clara had imagined this moment, some version of it in the back of her mind since October. She'd imagined feeling something big about it, satisfaction, or the particular pleasure of being right when someone important had said you were wrong. What she actually felt was quieter than that. She felt something more like exhaustion, and more like clarity, and more like yes. "Obviously, I knew that the whole time. You were one of about 100 people who were wrong that morning," she said. "You were just the loudest." He did look at her then, and something in his face, the certainty, the impenetrability of the man who was never wrong about horses, had shifted. Just slightly, just enough to see. He nodded once. Then he walked back to his horse and rode away, and Clara stood at the paddock gate and watched him go, and Shadow came up behind her and put her nose against Clara's shoulder, and Clara reached up and rested her hand on the mare's face without turning around. "I know," she said. "It doesn't change anything." But it did change something. Something small and interior that she wouldn't have been able to explain. It changed the quality of her certainty. Word traveled fast in a small valley. By the end of the week, the fact of Carter's visit had made the rounds of every ranch and feed store and Sunday social. Bill Hamlin mentioned it to her in the way he mentioned everything positioned as news designed as comment. "Here Carter came to see your horse." "He came to look at fence lines," Clara said. "Right," Hamlin said with a smile that meant he didn't believe that any more than she'd expected him to. "And spent 20 minutes at your paddock." Clara set her supply list on the counter. "How much do I owe you for this order?" He gave her a different look, then less amused, more something that might have been respectful if it had let itself finish. "He doesn't go places unless there's something worth going for Carter." "I know that about him," Clara said. "So what does it mean that he went to see your horse?" Clara picked up her supply list and folded it into her coat pocket. "It means he has better eyes than he used to." She paid her bill and walked out. The summer moved into fall, and fall hardened into another Montana winter, and Clara kept working. That was the period nobody would ever fully see. Not the auction morning, not the eventual competitions and the offers and the recognition, but the middle. The long, daily, unwitnessed middle of it. The mornings when her hands were so cold, she could barely hold the lead rope, and she worked Shadow anyway, because there was no version of this that involved stopping. The nights when the ranch accounts didn't balance, and she sat at the kitchen table with them until she found a way to make them balance. The weeks when nothing dramatic happened at all, when the only thing occurring was the slow accumulation of work and time, and the relationship between a woman and a horse that was becoming something neither of them had a word for. Elias came through the winter with her in the way he came through everything steadily without making a production of it. He fixed the section of roof over the hay storage in November without being asked. He appeared with a load of firewood in December that she hadn't requested and couldn't entirely refuse. He sat at her kitchen table in the evenings, sometimes when he'd stayed late enough that going home in the dark seemed like the sort of stubbornness that didn't serve anyone, and they talked about horses and about the valley and about things that weren't those things at all, but were conducted through the language of them. "You don't have to keep coming by," Clara told him one December evening, not as an invitation to stop, but as a statement of fact. She didn't want him there out of some obligation, some idea that she needed watching over. He looked at her from the other side of her kitchen table and said, I know that. Then why do you... He considered this question with the kind of seriousness he brought to everything that warranted it. Because I want to, he said simply. And because this is a ranch worth believing in. Clara was quiet for a moment. Which part of this are you talking about exactly? He met her eyes. Both parts, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked down at the papers on the table, and she said, "The accounts are a mess this month." "Let me see them," he said, and she passed them over, and they sat there in the lamplight, working through the numbers together, and neither of them said anything else about the other thing, but it was there in the room with them, clear as anything, the way the clearest things sometimes are. The second winter was harder than the first. January came in with a series of storms that kept everything inside for days at a time, and Clara was working the barn interior with Shadow during those stretches, doing what she could in the limited space, keeping them both from losing their minds to the confinement. Shadow was patient, as she always was, but Clara could feel the animal's energy building under the patience she needed more than a barn could offer. And the moment the storm broke enough, Clara was out in the paddock with her regardless of the temperature, and Shadow ran. Not the economy of motion walk, not the deliberate circuits she ran. Not wildly, not in panic, but with a power and speed and ease that stopped Clara cold in the middle of the paddock with the lead rope hanging from her hand and her breath stopped in her chest. She was fast. Not in the way fast horses were sometimes fast, all force and burning effort. She was fast the way water was fast when it found the right channel, effortless, inevitable, exactly what the terrain required. Clara stood and watched and understood something she hadn't fully registered before. She'd been thinking about Shadow as a breeding animal, a mare whose value was in what she'd pass on. That was true, and that was real, and that was part of what Samuel Hayes had confirmed. But Shadow herself. Shadow in this field on this morning, in this cold, was something beyond a vessel for a bloodline. She was extraordinary in her own right. Clara stood there in the cold, and felt something large and almost frightening move through her chest, the size of what she was holding, the size of what she'd picked up for $35 in an auction barn, while a crowd laughed at her. She made herself breathe. She made herself stay practical, because that was what this required. But the feeling didn't leave entirely. It just settled somewhere deeper, where she kept the things that mattered most. In February of that second year, a letter arrived from a man named George Aldrich in Helena, who wrote that he represented a group of investors interested in the development of working horse bloodlines in Montana Territory, and that he had heard through sources he didn't specify, but which Clara could guess at, that she was developing something of particular interest at her ranch. He wanted to discuss a partnership arrangement. He used the word partnership the way people used it when they meant something more like purchase with additional steps. Clara wrote him back on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table in the lamplight with the wind going at the windows. She wrote, "Thank you for your letter. I am not interested in a partnership arrangement at this time. The bloodline I am developing is not for sale or investment. I wish you well in your other endeavors. Sincerely, Clara Whitmore." She folded the letter and sealed it, and set it by the door to go out in the morning post. Then she sat for a moment in the quiet. She thought about what it meant that investors in Helena had heard about a horse on a 46-acre ranch in Red Hollow Valley. She thought about what it meant that they were already calling what she was doing a bloodline worth investing in. She thought about an October morning 2 years ago, $35 on an auction table, a barn full of laughter. She got up and went to bed, and was asleep in 4 minutes because she was always that tired. And in the morning she got up and went to the barn and worked the horse. Because that was what this was. That was always what it was. Not the letters, not the offers, not the moment of recognition that other people eventually extended. Not even the quiet evenings in the kitchen with Elias, though those were becoming something she counted on without admitting she counted on them. It was this. The cold mornings, the work, the conversation between her and Shadow that happened in the language of movement and pressure and release and patience, the slow building of something true. Elias arrived that morning while she was finishing, came in over the north fence the way he did when he was coming from his own place, and stood at the paddock watching for a few minutes before he said anything. "Letter from Aldrich," he said. Clara looked at him. "You know about the letter. I heard he was writing to people with horses worth writing to," he said. "I got one too." Told him no. "As you should have," Clara said. "Thought about telling him you'd say the same," he said. "Figured you'd rather tell him yourself." "I did," Clara said. He nodded. Then, "She's different this winter." Clara turned to look at Shadow, who was standing in the center of the paddock in the cold morning light. "How do you mean?" "Settled," he said. "Last winter she was still becoming. This year she's—" He stopped looking for the word. "Arrived," Clara said. "Yeah." He looked at her. "Arrived." They stood in the cold, looking at the horse for a moment, and then Elias said, "You're going to breed her this spring." It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," Clara said. "With who?" "I've been thinking about Danner's Bay Stallion," she said. "Not because he's famous, because of his endurance and his structure." Elias considered this. "Good choice," he said. "Not the obvious one." "The obvious one is never the right one," Clara said. He looked at her then with something in his eyes that was not about horses at all. And Clara held his gaze for a moment, and then turned back to Shadow, and the mare stood in the morning light like a promise that had been waiting 3 years to be kept. The valley didn't know what was coming. Most of the men who had laughed at her in that auction barn were still laughing, or had moved on to laughing at something else, or had simply forgotten the whole incident, the way people forgot things that didn't matter to them. Clara had not forgotten a single moment of it. She carried every bit of it, not as anger, not anymore, but as fuel. Shadow stood in the field and breathed the cold air, and her coat had come fully right by now, black and deep, and with a quality of light in it that caught the eye from a distance. 3 years from $35 to this, and this was not even close to where it was going. Clara latched the paddock gate and picked up her tools and walked back toward the barn, and Shadow followed her along the fence line for 20 yards. The way she sometimes did not, because she was trained to, not because there was a reward in it, but because that was the nature of the thing between them. You choose something that nobody else sees. You work. You don't stop. And somewhere in that long middle stretch between the laughter and whatever comes after the laughter, the thing you chose begins to prove what you knew all along. Clara went back to work, and Shadow stood in the cold field and waited, because she knew how to do that better than anyone, and she always had. The foal came on a Thursday morning in late March during the kind of stillness that arrives between the end of winter and the beginning of everything else. Clara had been up since 2 in the morning. She'd slept in the barn the 3 nights prior on a bedroll against the east wall, waking every hour to check on Shadow, who had been restless in that particular way that told Clara the time was close. She'd sent word to Samuel Hayes 2 days before, and he'd come out and confirmed it any day now, probably sooner than later be ready. She was ready. She'd been ready for months in the way you prepared for something you understood was important, and couldn't rush, and couldn't fully control. When Shadow went down at 2:30, Clara was already beside her. She didn't panic. She'd assisted at births before Thomas had made sure she knew how back when he was alive, and they were building the ranch together. And she'd told him she didn't need to know that. And he'd said, everyone on a working ranch needs to know that, and he'd been right, as he was, right about most practical things. She stayed quiet, stayed out of the way unless she was needed, kept her voice low and even when she spoke. The foal arrived at 3:20, a colt. Dark, not quite black, a deep brown-black that caught the lamplight the same way Shadow's coat did. He was on his feet in 11 minutes. Clara had her watch and she timed it because she needed something to do with her hands. 11 minutes. She'd seen foals that took 45. She'd seen some that needed help. This one stood up like he'd been practicing. She sat back against the stall wall and looked at him at his legs, which were proportioned right at the way he held his head, which was already up and taking things in, at the way he'd found Shadow and was nursing without confusion or hesitation. And she felt something move through her chest that she was not going to cry about, because she was too tired to cry and too practical for it, and because Thomas wasn't here to see this. And that was its own grief that she'd made her peace with mostly. She sat in the straw and watched the foal and the mare in the lamplight, and she said very quietly to no one, "There you are." She named him Proof, not because it was a grand name, not because she planned to announce it or explain it, just because that was what he was. That was what this moment was. 3 years of work, 3 years of patience, 3 years of $35 horses and laughing men, and silent mornings in the cold. And here was the proof of all of it standing on new legs in a barn in Red Hollow Valley at 3:20 in the morning. She wrote it in the ranch ledger the next day, in her careful hand, March 23rd, 1884. First foal, colt, dark bay black, dam shadow, sire Danner's monarch, all 4 legs sound, 11 minutes to stand, name, Proof. Elias saw the foal that afternoon. He came through the barn door and stopped when he saw the colt, and didn't say anything for a full minute. Clara watched him not say anything. "Well," he said finally. "I know," she said. "He's got her joints," Elias said, moving closer, crouching down to look at the legs the way Hayes had taught Clara to look at them. "Look at this. Same structure, same angle." "Same eyes," Clara said. Elias looked at the foal's eyes, that same quality of attention present and focused, and taking in everything around him without alarm. "Same eyes," he agreed. He stood up. He looked at Clara. "Hayes needs to see this." "I already wrote to him," Clara said. Elias looked at her for a moment, with something in his expression that was warm and direct, and he didn't dress it up or make a speech about it. He just said, "You did everything right." Clara looked at Proof, who was leaning against Shadow's flank, with the absolute confidence of something that had just arrived in the world and already understood it was safe. "Not yet," she said. "Ask me again in 6 months." Hayes came the following week and confirmed what Elias had seen. He looked at the foal the way he'd looked at Shadow 2 years before, with that long professional silence. And when he was done, he said, "The structure transferred. Both joints, both angles. This is what you breed for, and almost never get on the first foal." "What does that mean?" Clara asked, though she thought she knew. "It means the quality isn't accident," Hayes said. "It's genetic, stable, likely to repeat." He looked at her. "How many mares are you planning to breed Shadow with?" "I've been thinking about 2 more, Clara said. "Over the next 2 years. I don't want to rush her." He nodded. "Good instinct. Give Proof time to develop first. You'll want to see how the qualities hold as he grows before you make any decisions about showing or selling access." "I'm not selling access," Clara said. Hayes looked at her. "Mrs. Whitmore, if this colt develops the way his structure suggests he will, people are going to be offering you amounts that are difficult to refuse." "People have been offering me amounts that are difficult to refuse for 3 years, Clara said. "I've been refusing them." Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you want from this?" It was a real question. She could tell by the way he asked it, not rhetorical, not leading, just asking. "I want to build something that lasts," she said. "Not a sale, not a transaction. A line of horses that means something 50 years from now. That people point to and say that came from Red Hollow Valley. That came from a woman who knew what she was looking at." Hayes looked at her for a long moment. "Then you're going to need to protect it," he said. "Carefully. Because when the word gets out about this colt, and it will get out, you're going to have pressure from directions you haven't anticipated." She filed that warning in the same place she filed everything important. She had no idea yet how right he was going to be. The word got out that summer. She never knew exactly how. Small valleys were not good at keeping secrets, and she'd stopped trying to keep this one entirely. She'd had visitors Hayes had been seen coming and going. Elias was there regularly enough that people noticed, and people in Red Hollow talked. By July, most of the ranchers in the valley knew that Clara Whitmore's $35 auction horse had produced a foal, and that the foal was something unusual. The response was not uniform. Some people were genuinely curious, stopped by, asked to see, looked at Proof with real attention, and said things that sounded honest. Mrs. Lena Davies, who ran the East Side Ranch with her son after her husband passed, came one Saturday morning and watched Proof in the paddock for 20 minutes and said, "Lord above, look at the way he moves." And Clara liked her for saying it plainly. Some people were skeptical, in the way people are skeptical when something has already disproved what they said, which was a particular kind of uncomfortable skepticism that expressed itself as qualifications and reservations, and maybe wait and see. And some people were something else entirely. It was Bill Hamlin who first mentioned it to her in August, with the particular manner of a man who was telling her something because he'd decided it was better that she hear it from him. "There's talk," he said, "that Carter's been asking around about the provenance of your mare." Clara set down the item she was holding. Asking around how? Asking people who were at the auction that day what they remember, where the lot came from, what they know about the homestead. Hamlin paused. Asking the auctioneer specifically about the paperwork. Clara looked at him steadily. What kind of paperwork? Registration, bloodline documentation. Whether the mare was sold with anything that might have established her breeding. A cold, clear understanding moved through Clara's chest. She recognized it, the feeling of a situation developing its own momentum, something shifting in a direction she hadn't planned for. "And what did the auctioneer say?" she asked. "Said there was nothing," Hamlin replied. "No papers, no documentation. The lot came in without any." "That's true," Clara said. "I know that. I bought her without papers." "Right," Hamlin said, and he looked at her with something uncomfortable in his face. "But Carter's been talking to a lawyer." The silence between them had a new quality. "For what purpose?" Clara said. Hamlin looked like he'd rather be somewhere else. "I don't know exactly, but when a man like Carter starts talking to lawyers about a horse he told you wasn't worth buying..." He stopped. "I thought you should know." She drove home with her supplies in the wagon and her mind very still and very fast. At the same time, the way her mind got when something important needed thinking through. She went over everything she knew about Shadow's purchase. The auction papers. The bill of sale she'd signed. The receipt. All of it in the tin box on the shelf in her bedroom. She knew there were no bloodline papers. She'd known that from the start. Shadow had been sold without documentation, which was common for auction horses coming from broken-up homesteads where record-keeping had fallen apart. It didn't change what Shadow was. It didn't change what Hayes had confirmed. It didn't change what she'd built. But she understood with a clarity that settled cold in her stomach what a man with a lawyer could do with an undocumented horse and enough motivation and money. He could claim the lineage couldn't be proven. He could claim the bloodline was unestablished. He could, if he wanted to be truly aggressive about it, find some angle in the original lot documentation that raised questions about the legitimacy of the sale itself. She didn't know if that was what he was doing. Hamlin hadn't known either. But Carter was asking about provenance and talking to lawyers, and Clara had been in Red Hollow Valley long enough to know that men like Carter didn't do things without reason. She went to see Elias that evening. He was in his own barn when she arrived, and he came out when he heard the wagon, and he looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him what Hamlin had told her. Elias was quiet for a moment. Not the thinking kind of quiet, the very still kind. The kind that meant something was being held carefully. "He's going after the documentation," he said. "That's what it sounds like." "He doesn't have grounds," Elias said. "You have a legal bill of sale. The auctioneer's records will show a proper transaction. He can't undo that." "Can't he?" Clara said. "If he finds something in the original lot paperwork, if there's any question about how the Donahue estate was handled, whether the horses were properly included in the estate sale, whether the family had the legal right to sell them." She stopped. Elias was looking at her with the expression of a man who was arriving at the same conclusion at the same time. "He can't take Shadow," Elias said. "She's yours. That's settled law. But he could raise a question about proof," Clara said. "If there's any ambiguity about Shadow's lineage, if he can introduce doubt about whether her bloodline is what we believe it is, Whether Donahue's line can be authenticated, he might be able to challenge the value of what I'm building. Not legally take it. Just undermine it. Elias was very still. He doesn't want the horse, Clara said, hearing it as she said it, understanding it as she said it. He wants the bloodline. And if he can't buy it, the next best thing is making everyone doubt it exists. The following week was the hardest of the entire 3 years. Not because of the work. The work was always manageable, always something she could direct and complete. But because of the particular helplessness of sitting inside a threat she couldn't fully see the shape of, yet watching it develop in lawyers' offices and in conversations she wasn't part of, in the slow machinery of a powerful man, deciding he'd been wrong about something and wanting to correct it in a way that served him. She went to see a lawyer in town herself, a man named Prescott, who handled land disputes primarily and was recommended to her by Samuel Hayes, which meant she trusted him before she met him. Prescott was a careful man who read everything twice before he spoke. She laid out the full situation, the auction, the bill of sale, the documentation she had, what Hamlin had told her about Carter, her concerns about the bloodline question. He listened to all of it without interruption. Then he read the bill of sale. Then he read it again. "Your ownership of the mare is unimpeachable," he said. "The sale was legal, properly documented and recorded. Carter cannot challenge that." "But," Clara said because she could hear it in his voice, "the bloodline question is more complex," he said. "You have no documentation of her lineage. Hayes's professional opinion is valuable, but it's an opinion. If Carter wanted to make a public argument that the bloodline you're claiming the Donahue line is unsubstantiated, he couldn't be stopped from making that argument. Even if it's wrong. Even then," Prescott said, "he can't take your horse. He can't take your foal. But he could damage your reputation as a breeder. He could cast doubt on the value of the bloodline in the minds of buyers and other ranchers. That's a different kind of harm than legal dispossession, but it's real harm." Clara sat with that for a moment. What would prove it? She asked. What would end the question permanently? Prescott considered. Documentation from the Donahue estate would be ideal. Letters, records, anything that establishes the lineage in writing from the original breeder. Failing that... He paused. The horses prove themselves eventually. If the qualities pass consistently through multiple generations, if the bloodline demonstrates its value undeniably, the argument becomes moot. The proof becomes so public that no amount of doubt can stand against it. Clara looked at him steadily. "How long does that take?" "Years," he said. "Possibly many years." "I know how to wait," she said. She left Prescott's office and stood on the main street of Red Hollow for a moment in the August heat, and she thought about what she was going to do. She had two options as she saw it. She could do nothing and trust that Shadow's bloodline would prove itself in time, which it would, but which gave Carter years of space to shape the story in the meantime. Or she could try to find the Donahue documentation herself. She went to Elias with this question 3 days later, and she hadn't fully finished explaining it when he said, "I know where his daughter went." Clara stopped. "Donahue's daughter," Elias said. "Margaret. She was the one who handled the estate. She married a man from Billings named Connolly and moved east to Bismarck, I think last I heard." He paused. If Donahue kept breeding records, and he was a thorough man detailed, he kept records of everything. Margaret would have them, or know what happened to them. Clara looked at him. "You've been thinking about this." "Since Hamlin told you about Carter," he said. "I've been thinking about it." She looked at him, at the steadiness of him, the way he'd thought this through, before she asked the way he was always 2 steps ahead of what she needed, in the manner of someone who'd been paying close attention for a long time. "Elias," she said. "Yeah." "I need to write to Margaret Connolly." "I know," he said. "I'll find the address." She wrote the letter that night. She sat at the kitchen table long after the lamp started guttering and wrote it 3 times before she had it right. Not too urgent, not too restrained, honest about what she had and what she needed and why. She explained Shadow. She explained what Hayes had said. She explained Elias's belief about the bloodline. and she explained what was happening with Carter plainly without embellishment. Then she sealed it and left it on the table and went to bed and did not sleep for 2 hours because the waiting had already started and she hated waiting more than any other thing. 3 weeks passed. She worked. She always worked. Proof was growing into himself with the same steady purpose his mother had shown, and the watching of that was the thing that kept the anxiety from becoming fear. She could see it happening. Not hoped for, not imagined, but actually occurring in front of her. The qualities transmitting themselves in a colt, whose movement made Hayes's eyes go quiet every time he saw it. Carter said nothing publicly. He made no moves that she could see. But the lawyer's name kept coming up in conversations that found their way back to her, and she understood that the quiet was strategic, not resolution. She was in the barn on a Tuesday afternoon in September when she heard the wagon on the road and went to the barn door and saw the postman pulling up, which was unusual because he generally left things at the house. "Got something that wanted a signature," he said, holding out an envelope. The return address was Bismarck, Dakota Territory. Mrs. Margaret Connolly. Clara signed for it with a steady hand and waited until the postman had driven away before she opened it. She stood in the barn doorway with Shadow behind her and Proof at the edge of her peripheral vision, and she unfolded the letter. Margaret Connolly wrote a clear, plain hand. The letter was 2 pages. Clara read it once. Then she read it again. Then she sat down on the barn step because her legs had done something unexpected. John Donahue had kept records. Complete, thorough 22 years of breeding records in a leather-bound ledger that documented every horse, every pairing, every foal, every quality he'd been working toward. His daughter had the ledger. Had kept it because she knew it represented her father's life's work, even though no one had ever come asking about it. She'd heard nothing about the horses after the sale had assumed they'd all gone to ordinary places, had grieved that because her father had loved the work. She described Shadow. She described her without knowing. It was Shadow described the characteristics her father had been working toward: the joint structure, the intelligence, the endurance, the economy of motion. She described it as a standard her father had held himself to and believed he'd achieved in the last generation of animals before his health failed. And she wrote, "I have the papers on every horse from the final generation. I did not send them with the estate sale because I did not know they were wanted. If you believe you have one of my father's horses, if what you're describing is what I think it is, then you have something my father would have given anything to see grow into what you say it's becoming. Please write again. I would like to hear more. And if documentation would help you protect what you've built, I will send it." Clara sat on that barn step for a long time. Behind her, Shadow shifted in the stall and made a soft sound, and Proof looked up from the paddock at her with those eyes, that quality of attention she'd seen in the auction pen when she'd almost walked past without stopping. 3 years ago. $35. A barn full of laughter and a man with pale gray eyes telling her she'd bought herself 6 years of disappointment. She folded the letter carefully, the way you fold something you're going to keep forever, and she held it in both hands for a moment. Then she got up. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and wrote back to Margaret Connolly immediately. A longer letter, this time, all of it. The whole story from October 1881 to September 1884. Shadow and Hayes and Proof. And the offers she'd refused, and the lawyer and Carter, and what she was trying to build, and why. She wrote it honestly, the way she wrote everything without dressing it up. Then she wrote a second letter. To Prescott. She told him about Margaret Connolly. She told him about the records. She told him that the documentation he'd said would end the question permanently was available, and she wanted to know what steps to take to make it official. She dropped both letters at the post office the following morning, and when she walked out onto the main street of Red Hollow Valley, she felt something that she hadn't let herself feel clearly in 3 years. Not victory. It was too early for that. Something quieter. The feeling of a foundation being confirmed. The feeling of ground that you'd been standing on for a long time revealing itself to be bedrock. She was walking back to her wagon when she heard her name called. She turned to find William Carter crossing the street toward her, which was unusual enough that she went still. He stopped 2 feet away. He had the expression of a man who had prepared something to say and was now not entirely sure how to say it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Carter." He looked at her for a moment. "I understand you've been consulting with Prescott." "I have," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "I've been doing some research into the mayor's background." A pause. "My intentions were not." Another pause. "I wanted to understand what I'd missed." Clara looked at him steadily. "And do you understand it?" "I'm beginning to," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not comfortable to hear because it was too much like honesty from a man who hadn't been honest with her. "My lawyer's involvement was not directed at you," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "Was it directed at my horse?" He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to understand the provenance." "The provenance is documented," Clara said. "In Bismarck. I found it last week." Something moved across Carter's face. Surprise, and something under the surprise that might have been relief, which Clara hadn't expected and filed away to examine later. "Good," he said, and she thought he might actually mean it. "That's good." "Why?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "Because if the bloodline is what Hayes says it is, if it's what I think it is after watching that colt move, then it should be protected. Properly. Not sitting on uncertain ground where someone with bad intentions could challenge it." Clara looked at him. The man who had laughed at her in the auction barn. The man whose voice had followed her out the door. The man who had told a crowd she'd bought herself 6 years of disappointment. "Are you offering to help?" she asked. "I'm offering to stop being an obstacle," he said. "Which is different, and probably the most I've earned the right to offer." She held his gaze for a long moment. "That's the first honest thing you've said to me in 3 years," she said. He didn't argue with it. "I know." She looked at him once more, at the pride in the set of his jaw, and the discomfort and the thing underneath both of those that looked like a man trying to find his way to something better than he'd been. "All right," she said. "Don't be an obstacle. That's a start." She got in her wagon and drove home. Elias was waiting at the ranch when she returned, leaning against the paddock fence with his arms crossed. Watching Proof run the perimeter, the foal did that now, burning energy in short, brilliant bursts that made everyone who saw it stop talking. "What happened?" he asked, because he always knew when something had. She climbed down from the wagon. "I need to tell you about 2 letters," she said. "And then I need to tell you about a conversation." He straightened up. "Which first?" "The letters," she said. "The conversation will make more sense after." She told him everything, Margaret Connolly, the records, Carter on the street, all of it. He listened the way he always listened, completely without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The records are coming," he said. She said she'd send them. "And Carter's backing off. He says he's not an obstacle anymore." Elias looked out at Proof in the paddock. The colt had stopped running and was standing exactly as his mother stood still, centered, watching them with those dark, attentive eyes. "It's not over," Elias said. "No," Clara agreed. "It's not." "Carter backing off doesn't mean—" "I know what it doesn't mean," she said. "It means one less thing in the wrong direction. It doesn't change what still needs to be built." He looked at her. "You're not going to let yourself feel good about this, are you?" Clara looked at Proof. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket, folded and saved. She thought about a woman in Bismarck who'd kept her father's records because she believed they mattered, who'd waited years for someone to come asking. "I'll feel good about it," she said. "When the second foal comes. When the third foal comes. When the pattern is so clear that nobody can question it anymore." She paused. "When what my father—" She stopped. Elias waited. "When what Thomas believed about this ranch has been proven true," she said quietly. "When it's not just me saying it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's already not just you saying it. Hayes. Margaret Connolly. Carter in his own backwards way." He paused. "Me." She looked at him. "It's already not just you. he said. She held his gaze and she let herself feel what he was saying. Really feel it, not file it away, not hold it at a distance, the way she held most things that mattered. The fall was coming. The leaves were changing on the ridgeline. In the paddock, Proof ran another burst and stopped again, looking at nothing and everything with his father's size beginning to show in his legs and his mother's mind already fully present in his eyes. 2 foals to come. Documentation on its way from Bismarck. A valley that was watching now, even when it didn't want to admit it was watching. And the long work, the real work, the work that would prove everything just beginning. Clara turned back to the barn. There were things to do before dark, and dark came early in September, and she had never in 3 years let the dark find her standing still when there was still work to be done. Margaret Connolly's package arrived on a Wednesday morning in October, 3 weeks after Clara had mailed her second letter. It was heavier than Clara expected. She carried it from the post office to the wagon and set it on the seat beside her, and drove home without opening it, which was a thing she did with things that mattered. She waited until she was somewhere that felt right, until the moment matched the weight of what she was holding. She opened it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she didn't drink. The ledger was inside, wrapped in oilcloth and then in canvas, protected the way you protected something irreplaceable. It was thick, 2 inches of pages, filled in a close, careful hand that Clara understood immediately belonged to a man who had loved what he was documenting. John Donahue's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a man who had more to record than space to record it, and had made peace with compression. She turned to the first entry. January 1862. 22 years of it. Every pairing, every foal, every physical assessment written in the same careful shorthand joints, movement, quality, temperament, learning speed. Donahue had developed his own notation system, and it took Clara 20 minutes to decode it, but once she had it, the ledger opened up like a translation she'd been waiting for. She found Shadow on page 147. Donahue hadn't named her Shadow. He'd numbered her the way he numbered all his horses, a system based on bloodline generation and foaling order. But the description was unmistakable. Dark bay. Black exceptional joint symmetry. Atypical intelligence quotient. Movement economy above all previous recorded specimens. He'd written that last phrase, and then underlined it twice. Above all previous recorded specimens. In 22 years of careful breeding, Shadow was the best thing he'd produced, and he'd died before he knew what she'd become. Clara sat with the ledger open to page 147 for a long time. She thought about Donahue, a man she'd never met working quietly for 2 decades on something he believed in, something he never got to see proven. She thought about the homestead, breaking up the horses going to auction without anyone understanding what they were. She thought about a cold morning in October 1881 and a price tag that said $35 and a barn full of people who didn't look twice. She closed the ledger carefully. She went outside and stood at the paddock fence, where Proof was moving in the morning light, 18 months old now, and unmistakably his mother's son, not in color, which had come in darker, but in that quality of motion, that economy, that presence. "Your grandfather spent 22 years making you possible," she told him. Proof looked at her with Shadow's eyes. She took the ledger to Prescott that afternoon. He read the relevant pages slowly, made notes, read them again, and when he looked up, his expression was the careful kind that preceded good news delivered by a careful man. "This establishes everything," he said. "Bloodline lineage quality documentation. This is the kind of record that doesn't leave room for challenge." He set the ledger down. "Carter's lawyer has nothing to work with. Not now." "He backed off anyway," Clara said, "before the ledger arrived." Prescott looked at her. "Men like Carter back off when they see which way the wind is going. The ledger means the wind is permanent." She asked him to file copies with the Territorial Records Office to make the documentation official and public and part of the permanent record. She wanted no version of a future in which someone could question what Shadow was. He did it the following week, the day the territorial registration came back. Confirmed Shadow. Dam Donahue Line registration number 1884-MT 1-0-447. Clara put the certificate in the tin box with her other important papers and went out to the barn and stood with the mare for a while in the quiet. Shadow was 6 now. Past the restlessness of young horses settled into herself in the way that the best animals and the best people both settled, not slowing down, not diminishing, but becoming more completely what they'd always been. "It's official," Clara told her. Shadow breathed out slowly and put her nose against Clara's shoulder. "You were always worth it," Clara said. Took the paperwork a while to catch up. The second foal came in January of 1885, a filly this time, lighter in color than Proof. A dark gray that would probably shift over time with her mother's joint structure reproduced with such accuracy that Hayes, when he saw her, said nothing for almost 2 minutes, and then said quietly, "It's consistent." 2 words that carried everything. Consistent meant it wasn't luck. Consistent meant the ledger's documentation wasn't nostalgia or inflated record-keeping from a proud breeder. Consistent meant the qualities that Donahue had spent 22 years building were stable, heritable, reliable. Clara named the filly Evidence. Elias laughed when she told him the name. Not his usual almost laugh, but a real one, and she realized she hadn't heard that often enough, and filed that observation away in the place where she kept things she intended to do something about. "Proof and evidence," he said. "Seemed right," she said. "You're making a legal argument with your breeding program," he said. "I'm making an argument," she said. "Didn't say it was only legal." He looked at her with the warmth he usually kept at a careful distance, and this time he didn't pull it back as quickly as he usually did, and Clara didn't look away from it as quickly as she usually did, and there was a moment between them that wasn't about horses at all. Then Elias said, "Second foal with the same structure." Hayes confirmed it. Prescott's got the documentation filed. Carter's quiet. He paused. "You know what happens next." "People start paying attention," Clara said. "People start paying serious attention," he said, "the kind with money attached." She knew he was right. She'd been preparing for it in her mind for a year, thinking about what she wanted the program to look like when it became public in a real way, what terms she would and wouldn't accept, how to protect what she'd built from the particular kind of damage that came with success rather than the kind that came with failure. She'd talked to Prescott about it in December before the filly came. They'd worked out a structure, a breeding access agreement that preserved her control, required detailed record-keeping from any ranch that bred a Shadowline horse, and included a provision that any horse sold had to maintain its quality standards, or the Bloodline name couldn't be used. She hadn't told anyone about this yet, but it was ready. She was going to need it sooner than she'd thought. In February, a letter arrived from the Montana Territorial Horse Association inviting her to submit one of her horses for the spring showcase in Helena. The invitation was signed by the association's president, a man named Fletcher, who Clara knew only by reputation, serious, meticulous, not given to inviting animals that wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table and went to make more coffee and stood at the window for a few minutes thinking. Elias arrived that afternoon. He had a way of arriving when something needed to be decided, which she'd stopped finding coincidental and started finding reliable, and she showed him the letter without preamble. He read it, set it down, looked at her. "Which one?" "Proof," she said. "He's ready. Evidence is too young." Elias nodded slowly. "Helena in May. 3 months. What do you need to do to prepare him?" "What I've been doing," she said. "Consistently. No shortcuts, no rushing, no performing for people who are watching." She paused. "The work's the same. The audience just gets bigger." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "You're not nervous." "I didn't say that." "You seem—" "I'm terrified," she said simply. "This is the thing that either proves everything publicly or gives everyone who's been skeptical a reason to say they were right." She looked at him. "I know what's riding on it." "So do I," he said. And then quietly, "He's ready, Clara." She looked at him. She noticed, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, the way he said her name. Not Mrs. Whitmore, the way most people still said it. Not the formal address that maintained the respectful distance that Red Hollow Valley maintained around widows. Just her name with the particular weight of someone for whom it meant something specific and personal. "Stay for supper," she said. He looked at her. "You've been driving out here 5 times a week for 2.5 years, she said. "The least I can do is feed you." Something changed in his face. The careful management of it gave way just slightly to something more unguarded. "I'd like that," he said. They ate at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and they talked about the showcase, and about Fletcher, and about what Helena would mean, and they talked about other things too. Things that had been accumulating in the spaces around the horse conversations for a long time. She told him about Thomas, not the loss of him, she'd told him that before in fragments, but about who Thomas had been, the things he'd taught her, the way he'd looked at this ranch and seen what it could be. Elias listened the way he always listened, without filling the silences unnecessarily, and he told her about his own marriage briefly, a woman named Alice, who had left Red Hollow Valley 6 years before for reasons that were her own, and were not cruel, but had left him alone on his ranch, in the particular way that was different from loss through death, the kind of alone that came from someone choosing elsewhere. They talked until the lamp needed refilling, and Clara refilled it, and they kept talking. When he left that night, he stood in the doorway for a moment with his hat in his hands and said, "This ranch is going to be something, Clara, when the showcase is done, when the whole valley finally sees it." "I know," she said. "I'd like to be part of what it becomes," he said, "if you'll let me." She looked at him in the doorway with the cold night behind him and the lamplight between them, and she said, "You already are." He put his hat on and went out into the dark, and Clara stood at the door watching him go, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 3 years. Not grief leaving exactly, but something alongside grief, finally making room. She closed the door and went back to the kitchen table and sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed. And this time she slept immediately, and the sleep was the deep kind. The 3 months before the Helena showcase were the most intense of the entire 6 years. Not because the work changed, the work didn't change, that was the point. That was what she held herself to. But because the pressure of what was coming made every morning different. Every session with proof carried a weight it hadn't carried before. Not the weight of her doubts, she'd stopped having those, but the weight of consequence. This mattered. This was the thing that would happen publicly in front of people whose opinions shaped the market for everything she'd built. She did not let that weight change anything about how she worked. She noticed when it tried to. Noticed the mornings when she wanted to push him harder than was right, when the anxiety translated into the desire for more, faster, better. She caught it every time and put it back down and did the work the same way she'd always done it, at his pace with his welfare primary. Asking for what he was ready to give and not a thing beyond it. Hayes came twice in March to assess him. After the second visit, Hayes said, "You've done everything right." "Has anyone ever told you that you're very free with high praise?" Clara said. "No," he said seriously, "because I'm not. I say what I observe." "What do you observe?" "A horse that has been allowed to become exactly what he was bred to be," Hayes said. "Without interference, without shortcuts, without someone else's timeline imposed on his own." He paused. "In 37 years, I can count the ranchers who've managed that on one hand." Clara was quiet for a moment. "My husband taught me that," she said. "Let the thing be what it is. Trust the process. Don't try to make it happen faster than it wants to happen." Hayes looked at her. He was a wise man. He was, she said. He would have loved this horse. The morning she loaded proof for Helena, the entire valley seemed to know about it. She hadn't announced anything. She never announced anything. But Red Hollow Valley had been watching her ranch for 3 years now, and people noticed when a horse that had become a subject of considerable speculation was loaded into a transport trailer at dawn on a Thursday morning. Bill Hamlin was standing outside the feed store when she drove past. He raised a hand. She raised hers back. "Mrs. Lena Davies, who had said, "Lord above, look at the way he moves," was coming out of the dry goods store, and she stopped and watched Clara's wagon go past with an expression of something like pride, which Clara noticed and felt. 3 other wagons and riders she recognized lifted their hands or their hats as she drove through town. Red Hollow Valley was not good at apologies. It was not built for them. But it had a language of acknowledgement that expressed itself in small gestures, a raised hand, a held gaze, a moment of silence that said, "We are watching, and we believe you might be right." It was the closest the valley got to. I was wrong, and here it mattered. She drove through town and out the other side toward Helena, and she did not look back. Elias met her on the road outside town. He'd said he was coming, hadn't asked, had said, and she'd told him she wasn't going to argue about it, and he'd looked at her with that almost smile, and that had been the end of the conversation. He rode beside the wagon for an hour, without speaking much, which was one of the things she valued most about him. He understood when silence was the right company. Halfway to Helena, he said, "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been building toward this for 6 years," she said. "And like it's still possible to lose it all in one afternoon." "You can't lose what you've built," he said. "The bloodline exists. The documentation exists. Hayes's assessments exist. None of that disappears if Proof has a bad day in Helena." "I know that," she said. But I want him to have a good day," she said. "I want them to see him. I want to stop being the woman who bought a $35 horse and start being the woman who built something worth remembering." Elias was quiet for a moment. "You're already the second thing." "I want Helena to agree," she said. He said nothing else, which was the right answer. The Helena showcase was held over 2 days, with judging on the second afternoon. There were 34 entries horses from the biggest ranches in Montana Territory, horses with papers going back 5 generations, horses whose sires' names were known throughout the Western Territories. The association members moved through the entrance with clipboards and the particular detachment of men who had seen a great many horses and knew the difference between impressive and exceptional. Proof walked into that space like he'd been there before. That was the thing Clara would remember afterward. Not the judges' faces when they watched him move, not the conversations that started happening around her, not the moment when she heard people asking who he belonged to and who his dam was. She would remember walking him into the showgrounds and feeling the way he carried himself. No extra tension, no reaction to the crowd and the noise and the unfamiliar horses around him, just that quality of presence that settled, focused attention directed outward at everything and disturbed by nothing. Shadow's son. Shadow's mind in a body built for what was coming. The first day's evaluation was movement and confirmation. Proof moved through the assessment pattern with the judges watching from 3 angles, and Clara watched the judges instead of the horse, because she knew the horse it was their faces she needed to read. She saw it happen, saw the moment one judge, a man with 30 years' experience whose name was Homestead, stopped making marks on his clipboard and simply watched. Saw him say something to the judge beside him without looking away from Proof. Saw the second judge look up, and then the second judge stopped making marks too. After the assessment, Homestead came to find her. "You bred this horse?" he asked. "I did," she said. "Who is the dam?" "A mare named Shadow. Donahue line registered in the Territorial Records 1884. He looked at her. "Donahue, as in John Donahue out of the Billings Territory." Clara felt something go very still and very alert. "You know the name?" "I heard of his work," Homestead said carefully, in the way people said carefully what they had not expected to be saying. 20 years ago more. A man who was doing something unusual with working horse lineages. Word was the work had been lost when he died. "It wasn't lost," Clara said. "It was at auction in Red Hollow Valley. It cost $35. Homestead looked at her. "I have the original breeding ledger," she said. 22 years of documentation. Registered with the Territorial Records Office. If you'd like to see it, I have copies with me." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man revising something significant. "Yes," he said. I would very much like to see that. That night in the boarding house, Clara sat on the edge of the bed and wrote in the small journal she'd started keeping the year after the auction. She didn't write every day, she didn't have the time, and hadn't the inclination to perform introspection. But she wrote when something happened that she wanted to have words for later. She wrote, "He moved beautifully today. Homestead knows Donahue's name. Tomorrow is the judging." Then she sat for a moment and wrote one more line. "Thomas, I wish you could see this." She closed the journal and went to sleep. The judging was in the afternoon of the second day. 34 horses. She stood with Proof at the holding area and waited, and she felt very precisely everything she was feeling, the years of it. The mornings, and the wire cutters, and the cold hands, and the laughing men, and the letters refused, and the ledger found, and the filly named evidence standing in a barn 40 miles away, carrying the next generation forward. She felt all of it at once, and she let herself feel it, because denying it would have been dishonest, and she had no use for dishonesty even toward herself. Elias was at the fence. He caught her eye and held it for a moment, and that was enough. When they called Proof's class, she let him in. He walked beside her with his head up, ears forward, taking everything in. She unclipped the lead when the judge signaled, and she stepped back, and Proof moved. The crowd not large but serious. The kind of crowd that came to watch horses for reasons beyond entertainment went quiet in the way Clara had learned to read. Not the quiet of disinterest, the quiet of attention. The quiet of people watching something that required their full concentration because they didn't want to miss any part of it. Proof moved through the evaluation space with 22 years of careful breeding expressed in every step. Not performing, not showing off. Just being exactly what he was, completely without apology and without effort, which was the most extraordinary thing of all. That it looked effortless, that all the work and the waiting and the years had produced something that looked as natural as breathing. Clara stood at the side of the space and watched and did not move. The first place ribbon was red and white and handed to her by Homestead, who said as he placed it, "Mrs. Whitmore, I believe you've just introduced this territory to something it's going to be talking about for a very long time." Clara looked at the ribbon in her hand. She thought about $35 and a cold October morning. She thought about a barn full of laughter. She thought about Thomas. She thought about Shadow standing in that auction pen with her ribs showing slightly and her eyes full of attention that nobody had bothered to see. She thought about Elias at the fence right now, watching her, not saying anything because he knew she didn't need anything said. She looked at Homestead and said thank you, and then she looked out at Proof, who had come back to stand quietly beside her, as if he'd always known this was where he was supposed to end up. And she said softly, just to him, "Your grandmother did this. Don't let anybody forget that." The aftermath was immediate and not fully manageable. By the time she'd loaded Proof for the drive home, 4 ranchers had approached her about breeding access. Not the tentative, polite inquiries she'd been fielding for 2 years, serious conversations, names and numbers, men who had watched the judging and done rapid calculations and arrived at her with intent. She was polite to each of them. She told each of them the same thing. She had a breeding agreement structure that she'd be happy to discuss at her ranch, not here, not today, but soon. She gave them Prescott's name. She said she would be in touch. 2 of them pressed. One of them named a figure that she didn't react to outwardly, and did react to inwardly. It was more money than the ranch had made in the past 3 years combined. "I understand you're serious," she told him. "I'll be in touch next week." On the drive home, Elias rode beside her wagon again. He didn't ask how she was feeling this time. He knew. They rode in silence for a good hour before Clara said, 4 of them, in the first 20 minutes. "I counted," he said. "There'll be more." "Yes," he said. "I need to call in Prescott this week. Get the agreements ready." "I'll be there when you meet with him," he said. "If you want." She looked at him sideways. "You're going to be there for a lot of things from now on, aren't you?" He met her eyes. "If you'll let me." It was the second time he'd said those words. The first time had been at her kitchen door about the ranch. This time the sentence was carrying something different, and they both knew it, and neither of them dressed it up. "I've been letting you," she said, "in case you hadn't noticed, for the past 2.5 years." Something in his face went warm and quiet at the same time. "I noticed," he said. She turned back to the road. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." They rode the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that was not empty but full of the specific understanding between two people who have arrived at something they've been arriving at for a long time and are finally allowing themselves to be there. When they reached the ranch as the sun was going down, the first thing Clara did was go to the barn. She led Proof into his stall and saw to him properly. Haywater checked his legs, gave him time to settle from the journey. She was thorough, and she was calm, which was how she was with every horse, regardless of what that horse had just done in Helena. Then she went to Shadow's stall. The mare turned to look at her with those dark, attentive eyes. Clara stood at the stall door for a moment. "He won," she said. Shadow regarded her. "First place," Clara said. "And Homestead knew your grandfather's name." She put her hand on the mare's face. "4 ranchers want access before I've even unloaded the wagon." Shadow breathed out slowly warm air against Clara's palm. "You're going to have a 3rd foal in the spring," Clara told her. "And then we're going to see about evidence when she's ready. And it's going to be real Shadow. The thing we talked about that first morning in the barn when you were eating hay, and I was probably out of my mind. It's going to be exactly what I said." She stood with the mare in the quiet of the barn, while outside, Elias moved around doing things that needed doing. The sounds of him familiar now, in the way the sounds of the ranch were familiar. The way the particular sounds of a person become part of the texture of a place you think of as yours. She took a long, even breath. The tin box on the bedroom shelf held a bill of sale for $35, a territorial registration certificate, copies of 22 years of breeding records, and a red and white ribbon from the Helena Territorial Horse Showcase. None of those things was what mattered most. What mattered most was a black mare in a stall in a barn on 46 acres on the western side of a valley in Montana who had been written off at auction because nobody had the patience to look at what she actually was. And a woman who had looked, and who had kept looking every morning for 6 years. The valley would understand now. The territory would understand. The men with money and the judges with clipboards and the investors in Billings and Helena would all gradually understand. Clara had understood it first. In a cold auction barn on an October morning for $35 before anyone else bothered to look. That was the thing that would never change no matter what came next. She was first, and she had been right, and the work was not finished. The 3rd foal came in April of 1886, and Clara was not surprised by what she saw when the animal stood up. She had stopped being surprised by Shadow's offspring 2 foals ago. What she felt now when a new one arrived was something different from surprise, something quieter and more serious, closer to confirmation. Closer to the feeling of a mathematician checking a proof and finding it holds again and again and again. The 3rd foal was a filly. Dark bay lighter than Proof, with a broad forehead and the same quality of joint structure that Hayes had now assessed on 3 separate animals, and each time described with fewer words and more silence because he was running out of new ways to say extraordinary and had apparently decided that silence communicated it better anyway. Clara named her 3rd Count, which was not a romantic name and was not meant to be. It was a record. It was a statement. 3 foals from one dam, and every single one of them carrying the same qualities in the same proportions. Documented now in the ledger. Clara kept herself her own ledger built on the structure of Donohue's, carrying his work forward in her hand instead of his. Elias was there for the birth which had become the pattern. He was there for most things now, and the ranch had adjusted itself around his presence, the way a living thing adjusts to something that belongs not dramatically, just organically. One small accommodation at a time, until his truck at the gate, and his voice in the barn, and his boots by the door were as much a part of the place as the creak of the east wall in the wind. When the filly was an hour old and nursing, and the immediate crisis of the night had resolved into the particular exhausted peace that followed a successful birth, Elias made coffee and brought it out to the barn and sat with Clara on the hay bales, and they drank it in the dark without talking much. After a while, Elias said, 3. 3, Clara said. Hayes is going to run out of things to say. He ran out a foal ago, Clara said. He's been using silence as punctuation. Elias almost smiled. Then seriously, what does 3 mean for the program? Clara thought about it. She'd been thinking about it for months in the back of her mind, where the long-range thinking lived. It means the consistency is provable, she said. Not just arguable. Provable. Anyone who looks at the 3 of them, and the documentation and what proof did at Helena, there's no honest counter-argument left. Carter tried to offer you $5,000 last week, Elias said. Clara looked at him. How do you know that? Because he stopped me on the road and asked me to mention it to you, he said. In case you'd be more receptive coming from me. Clara was quiet for a moment. $5,000 was a number that would have changed her life entirely 2 years ago. It would still change her life now in material terms. She knew what $5,000 meant. The ranch debt, the improvements she'd been deferring, the expansion she'd been thinking about in the abstract, because the concrete version wasn't yet funded. What did you tell him? She asked. I told him you'd say no, Elias said, and that I wasn't going to be his messenger, and that if he wanted to make you an offer, he was welcome to ride out and make it himself like a man. And what did he say? He said he didn't think you'd give him the time of day. Clara looked at the filly nursing in the lamplight. He's wrong about that, she said. I'd give him the time of day. I'd tell him no to his face, which is more than he deserves, but I'd do it properly. Elias looked at her sideways. Is that warmth toward Carter I'm hearing? Don't push it, she said. But there was something in her voice that was not quite as hard as the words, and they both heard it. She had thought about Carter a great deal over the past year. Not with anger. The anger had burned itself out somewhere in the second winter, when she'd understood that carrying it was expensive, and she had too many other things to spend herself on. What she thought about instead was what his behavior meant as a piece of information. Carter was not a stupid man. He was not without judgment. He had been wrong about Shadow badly and publicly, but when he'd been wrong, he had eventually changed course, rather than doubling down on wrongness forever. There was something in that worth acknowledging, even if she wasn't ready to say so out loud. She wasn't ready yet. But she was closer than she'd been. Carter came to the ranch himself in May without sending word ahead, which Clara thought was probably deliberate. He knew if he asked to come, she might say no, and arriving was harder to refuse. She was in the barn when she heard the horse at the gate, and she came out to find him dismounting at the post with the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and was not entirely certain it would survive contact with the recipient. Mr. Carter, she said. Mrs. Whitmore. He held his hat in his hands. I hear the 3rd foal came. A filly, Clara said, 3 weeks ago. May I see her? She considered him for a moment. He was 63 now, his hair more gray than she remembered, but he still carried himself with the bone-deep confidence of a man who had never spent much time doubting himself. Except that standing here, hat in his hands, something in the set of his shoulders was different. Not reduced. Carter was not a man who would ever look reduced, but differently arranged. Like something had been put down. Come on, she said, and led him into the barn. He looked at the filly for a long time. He didn't say anything which was new. The Carter she'd known for 6 years always had something to say. He looked at third count, the way Hayes looked at horses, with that complete absorbing attention, and Clara stood back and let him. Finally he said, 3 from the same dam. 3, Clara said. All with the same structure. All documented. He was quiet for another moment. Then, you know what Homestead said about your colt after Helena? I've heard some of it, she said. He said he'd been in this business for 30 years, and he'd seen exactly 2 horses with that quality of movement, Carter said. 2. In 30 years. He paused. He said one of those 2 was your colt. Clara looked at third count. What was the other one? A horse out of Kentucky 20 years ago, Carter said. Sold for $8,000. Silence between them. I offered you 5,000 for the dam, Carter said. I know, she said. You're going to say no. I am, she said. He nodded slowly, not resigned, not arguing, just receiving information he'd expected but needed to hear directly. What would you take for a breeding agreement for Proof's first season? Clara turned to look at him fully. Are you asking about access to the colt? I am. Then you need to talk to Prescott, she said. Not me. The terms are set. They're the same for everyone. Everyone. He said it in a way that made it a question. Everyone, she said. There's no preferential access. Not for money, not for reputation, not for anything else. The terms are standard, and they're non-negotiable. He was very still for a moment. Clara recognized what she was watching a man who had spent his entire adult life being the person whose position secured him different terms, better access, special consideration, watching that tool fail to work in real time. All right, he said. Talk to Prescott, she said again. He'll explain the agreement. Carter put his hat back on. He stood in the barn doorway and looked back at the filly one more time. Then he said, You know I've been in this valley 30 years. I've seen some ranching. I've seen some breeding. I've seen people build things. He stopped. Clara waited. I've never seen anything built the way you built this, he said. That's what I came to say. Not about the money. That's what I should have said a long time ago. Clara stood in the barn doorway and looked at William Carter, and she held what he'd said for a moment before she answered it. You weren't ready to say it a long time ago, she said. Neither was the valley. He met her eyes. Are you ready to hear it? She considered. Yes, she said. I think I am. He nodded once. The way he'd nodded that first day he'd come to the paddock and admitted he was wrong about Shadow, that single formal acknowledgement that was as close as Carter got to a full concession. Then he untied his horse and mounted and rode back down her road, and Clara watched him go and felt at last the particular settling of a long account, not satisfaction. Something more lasting than satisfaction. Something that didn't require anyone else's validation to exist but was made whole by receiving it anyway. She went back to the barn and stood with third count and said quietly, That's the last one. The filly looked at her. That's the last apology I was waiting for, Clara said. We can stop counting those now. The summer of 1886 was the summer the outside world arrived in Red Hollow Valley in earnest. Not just the investors and brokers who had been circling for 2 years, but representatives from the Territorial Agricultural Board. 2 men from the United States Department of Agriculture who were documenting exceptional breeding programs across the Western Territories. A journalist from a Helena newspaper who wanted to write about what Clara was building, and a woman from the Montana Women's Civic Association who wanted to talk about Clara's story as an example of something the association was trying to document women who had built something significant in the territory outside the expected channels. Clara was not comfortable with most of this. She was not comfortable with the journalist specifically. He came out on a Tuesday, in June, young and enthusiastic, and carrying a notebook, and he asked questions that were structured to produce a certain kind of story. The plucky widow, the ridiculous investment, the against all odds triumph. He kept trying to get her to describe the laughter in the auction barn, kept returning to the $35 as a rhetorical device. She answered his questions and redirected him every time. The story isn't about the $35, she told him patiently the third time he returned to it. The $35 is just where it started. The story is about 22 years of work by a man named John Donahue that almost got lost, and the people who made sure it didn't. But you bought the horse for $35, the journalist said. I did, she said. And Donahue spent 22 years making her worth buying. Which part of that do you think is more interesting? He wrote about both parts ultimately, which was fair enough. The article appeared in late July. Clara read it once and put it in the tin box, and didn't think about it much except that it brought 2 more letters from breeders in Idaho and Wyoming who'd read it, both of which she referred to Prescott. The woman from the Civic Association was different. Her name was Ruth Alderson, and she arrived without a notebook and without an agenda that Clara could detect, and she sat at Clara's kitchen table and drank coffee and asked questions that were not structured toward a predetermined story. She asked about Donahue. She asked about Margaret Connolly. She asked about Hayes and what his professional assessment had meant for the breeding program legally and practically. She asked about the structure of the breeding agreements and why Clara had insisted on the non-preferential terms. Clara answered everything. At the end of an hour, Ruth Alderson said, "What you've built here is going to be referenced in this territory for 50 years. "That's what I wanted," Clara said. "The horses?" Ruth asked. "The fact that it happened this way," Clara said. "That the documentation is complete, the lineage is established, the terms are equal for everyone who accesses it. I want there to be no version of the future in which this gets absorbed into someone else's story and the origin disappears." She paused. "Donahue's work almost disappeared. I'm not letting this disappear." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "What do you want people to remember?" Clara thought about it seriously, because it was a serious question, and Ruth deserved a serious answer. "I want them to remember that the horse was there the whole time," she said finally, in a $35 auction pen with her ribs showing. "She didn't become valuable. She always was valuable. The only thing that changed was that someone stopped and looked at her." Ruth wrote that down. Clara noticed and didn't object. That fall, Margaret Connolly came to Red Hollow Valley. She'd written ahead a letter in October saying she was planning to travel west, that she'd never stopped thinking about the horses since Clara's first letter, that she wanted to see what had been built from her father's work if Clara would allow it. She was 61 years old and had never, she wrote, made a trip like this, but she thought it was time. Clara wrote back, "Come, you are very welcome." Margaret arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in November, thin and upright, and with her father's careful eyes, Clara saw it immediately, that quality of close observation, the same look Hayes had and Elias had, and Clara herself had the look of someone who spent their life really seeing things. Clara brought her to Shadow first, because that was right. That was the order things should happen in. Margaret stood at the stall door and looked at the mare, and Clara watched Margaret the way she always watched people looking at Shadow for what their face did in the first 30 seconds before they had time to compose it. What Margaret's face did was cry, not loudly, not dramatically, just a slow filling of the eyes and a precise contained overflow that she didn't try to stop or apologize for. She looked at Shadow the way people looked at something they'd been hoping to find for years and had almost given up on. "She's exactly what he described," Margaret said. In the final entries, he knew she was exceptional. He wrote it 3 times, which he never did. Above all previous recorded specimens, he underlined it twice. She stopped. He died 4 months after she was born. He never saw her past the first weeks. Clara said nothing. There wasn't anything to say that would improve on the silence. Margaret reached out and touched Shadow's face with careful hands. Shadow held still and let her, which was not something Shadow did with everyone, and Clara noticed it. He would have... Margaret started and stopped. "I know," Clara said. They stood in the barn together, the woman who had built the legacy, and the woman who had almost lost it, and between them, the mare who had been the beginning of everything, stood quietly in the way she had always stood, patient, attentive entirely herself. After a while, Margaret said, "Thank you for writing to me." "Thank you for having the records," Clara said. "I didn't know what to do with them," Margaret said. "After the estate was sold, I just kept them, because they were his, because I couldn't put them in the ground with him." She looked at Clara. "I didn't know someone would need them." "Someone needed them," Clara said. "And they were exactly what was needed at exactly the right time." Margaret stayed for 4 days. Clara showed her everything: the ledger, her own records built, on her father's, the breeding agreements on file with Prescott, the correspondence with the Territorial Records Office, the article from the Helena paper. She took her to see Proof, who by now was 3 years old, and fully arrived into what he was going to be, and watching Margaret look at Proof was something Clara knew she was going to carry for the rest of her life. Margaret stood at the paddock fence, watching Proof move, and she said softly, mostly to herself, "That's what he was working toward, for 22 years, that." On the last morning at the kitchen table over coffee, Margaret said, "What happens now with the program?" "Evidence is 18 months old," Clara said. "She'll be ready to breed in another 2 years. Proof will have his first season of access agreements next spring. I'm thinking about bringing in one more stallion, not for Shadow. She's given everything I was going to ask of her, but for a parallel line, to see whether the qualities compound or dilute across different bloodlines." Margaret listened carefully. "You've thought this all through?" "Every morning for 5 years," Clara said. Margaret smiled a real smile, the kind that came from something deep and settled. "My father would have liked you enormously," she said. Clara looked at her coffee cup. "I would have liked to know him," she said honestly. When Margaret's wagon left the ranch that morning, Clara stood at the gate and watched it go, and Elias stood beside her, and they were quiet together for a while. "She looked like her father's work was alive again," Elias said. "It is," Clara said. "That's the point." He put his hand over hers on the fence rail, and she turned her palm up and held it, and they stood like that while the wagon disappeared around the bend in the road, and the November morning came down cold and clear around them. Shadow was in the field behind them, moving at her own pace, following the circuit she'd always followed, not because she was being asked to, but because it was what she did, the expression of something internal that Clara had long since stopped trying to name. The mare was 9 years old. In horse terms, she was not young, but she was not old either. She was in the fullness of it, the settled, certain fullness of a creature that had been allowed to become exactly what it was, and had arrived there completely. Her coat had come in black, deep, and permanent years ago, the rough condition of the auction pen as gone as if it had never been. Her movement had lost nothing and gained a particular ease that came from years of right work of being asked to do what she was made for, and never more and never less. Clara watched her for a long time. She thought about the first morning, the barn lamp and the oilcloth smell, and the decision she'd made before she'd admitted she was making it. Standing at the auction pen fence, watching an underfed mare think. She thought about $35, and the way the laughter had followed her out the door, and the way she'd stood in the cold outside with the paperwork in her hand, and told herself, "You saw something. Trust what you saw." She had trusted it for 6 years. Through the winters and the debt and the men with money and the men with lawyers and the long middle stretch of unwitnessed daily work that nobody would ever see, but that was the actual substance of everything. The part that couldn't be skipped, couldn't be shortcut, couldn't be purchased or inherited or arrived at by any road except the long one. Elias squeezed her hand. She looked at him. "You're thinking about all of it," he said. It wasn't a question. "All of it," she agreed. "What does it feel like?" She thought about this honestly because honest answers were the only kind she'd ever given herself. "Like the ground is solid," she said. "Like I've been walking on ground that might not hold for 6 years, and now it's solid, and I know it's solid, and it's going to stay solid." She paused. "Like I can stop checking every step." He looked at her with everything in his face that had been building for 2.5 years, and this time neither of them looked away or redirected it into practicalities. "I was thinking," he said, "about the north field, the one that borders my place." Clara looked at him. "What about it?" "I was thinking about what it would mean to take that fence down," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The north field, the fence that separated her 46 acres from his 120, the border between her ranch and his, that had been there since before either of them arrived in the valley. "That's a significant fence to take down," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Taking down a fence like that implies certain things." "It does," he said. "Permanent things." "That was my understanding," he said. She looked at him for a long time in the cold November morning, At the face she'd been watching for 2.5 years learned to be less guarded at the hands that had fixed her roof in November and brought firewood in December and held the lead rope when she needed a second set of hands and held her hand right now at the gate. "Talk to me about it this winter," she said, "when things slow down." "Things never slow down on your ranch," he said. "No," she agreed. "But we'll make time." "All right," he said. And then quietly, with everything he meant in it, "All right." They stayed at the fence until Shadow finished her circuit and came toward them the way she sometimes did not, because she was trained to, just because she wanted to, and put her face over the rail and breathed out into Clara's hands. Clara held the mare's face in both palms, the way she'd held it 100 mornings, and she stood there in the cold, with the man she'd been letting in for 2.5 years, and the horse that had started everything, and she felt the weight of the past 6 years, not as a burden, but as a foundation. Solid, permanent, hers. That winter was the first in 6 years that Clara slept through most nights. Not every night there were still foals to watch for accounts to balance the 100 small anxieties of a working ranch that never entirely went quiet. But most nights. The particular insomnia of a woman fighting a battle whose outcome was uncertain had been replaced by the ordinary tiredness of a woman doing large amounts of work. And ordinary tiredness yielded to sleep the way it was supposed to. She kept working on the ledger. Every morning after the barn chores, before whatever else the day required, she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and wrote assessments, observations, the slow accumulation of detail that would tell the story of the bloodline to whoever came next. She was building something she intended to outlast her, and the documentation was as much a part of that as the horses themselves. She understood that now. Donahue had understood it too, in his barn in Billings, writing in his small, precise hand for 22 years. The work and the record of the work were not separate things. They were both necessary. They were both the legacy. In December, a letter arrived from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The 2 men who had visited in the summer had completed their report on exceptional breeding programs in the Western Territories. Clara's program was the lead example in the section on working horse bloodlines. Her documentation practices were cited specifically as a model for the field. The Donahue line, as established and developed at the Whitmore Ranch in Red Hollow Valley, Montana Territory, was recommended for formal inclusion in the Federal Registry of Significant American Horse Bloodlines. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then set it down and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Then she went to the barn. Shadow was in her stall, 9 years old, eating hay with the same unhurried deliberateness she brought to everything. She looked up when Clara came in and held her eyes the way she'd always done, that quality of complete attention, directed and present and entirely without performance. "You're in the Federal Registry," Clara told her. The mare looked at her. "The United States government has a file on you," Clara said. "You cost $35. She put her hand on Shadow's face. She thought about all the mornings. Every single one of them. The cold hands and the wire cutters and the feed store and Carter's laugh echoing in that barn. And the letter from Billings and the filly named Evidence and the colt named Proof and the third foal named Third Count. And Margaret standing at the stall door with tears in her careful eyes, and Elias at the fence in the November morning saying that fence implies certain things. She thought about Thomas. She thought about what he would have said. He would not have made a speech about it. He would have looked at the letter and looked at the horse and looked at her and said something brief and precise that contained everything. He'd had a gift for that. She thought she knew what he would have said. She said it out loud instead in the quiet of the barn. "You always were." That spring, Elias brought out a fence puller and a stack of new posts, and they took down the north fence together on a Saturday morning in March, working from opposite sides toward the middle. And when the last section came down, they stood in the open ground where the fence had been and looked at the 2 ranches that were now one and didn't say anything for a while. Evidence ran the combined field for the first time that afternoon, 18 months old, long-legged, moving with the same quality her mother moved, with her grandmother's intelligence in her eyes, and her joints structured exactly as Hayes had predicted they would be structured. She ran with a joy that made Clara stop what she was doing and just watch, because some things were worth stopping for. Proof was in the north section already in his first season of Access, the breeding agreements executed and on file with Prescott and logged with the Territorial Registry. 3 mares from 3 different ranches, one of them a Carter Ranch mare, which Clara had allowed because Carter had come to Prescott and met the terms and abided by them, and she was not a person who held grudges past the point of usefulness. The program was running. The bloodline was documented, registered, protected, and proving itself in foals across the valley that were not yet born, but were coming. Donahue's 22 years was becoming 30 years, and then 40, carried forward by a woman who had never met him and had understood him completely. Clara stood in the middle of the field that used to have a fence in it and watched evidence run and felt the ground solid under her feet and the morning around her and Elias's shoulder against hers. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about a cold morning in October 1881, she said. "I'm thinking about a barn full of people who'd already decided. And I'm thinking that the most important thing I ever did," she said, "was stop." He looked at her. "Just stop," she said, "at a pen that everyone else walked past, and look at what was actually there instead of what everyone had already decided was there." She watched evidence circle the field in the March morning, brilliant and young, and carrying everything forward. "One stop," Clara said quietly. "That's all it was. The rest was just work." Elias looked at her profile, at the set of her jaw, and the certainty that had always been there, and the way 6 years had not softened it, but deepened it, the way good things deepened, rather than softened, when time and work and truth ran through them. "The rest was not just work," he said. "The rest was you." She looked at him. "Everything after that one stop," he said, "was you." She held his gaze for a long moment in the March morning, with the sound of evidence running somewhere behind them, and the 2 ranches open to each other, where the fence used to be. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, "that I was worth stopping for too." Elias looked at her with everything in his eyes that he'd been carrying for 3 years. "Clara," he said, "you always were." The Donahue line, as established at the Whitmore Ranch in Red Hollow Valley, Montana Territory, went on to shape working horse breeding across the American West for the next 4 decades. The bloodline's qualities documented first in a dead man's careful hand, and continued in a widow's steady one, proved stable and heritable across generation after generation, exactly as John Donahue had believed they would, exactly as Samuel Hayes had confirmed, exactly as Clara Whitmore had known from a cold October morning, when she had walked into an auction pen while everyone else walked past and looked at a $35 horse and seen what was actually there. The ranch ledger, kept first by Donahue and continued by Clara, eventually ran to 6 volumes. It was donated to the Montana Territorial Historical Society by Clara Whitmore Cade in 1901, with a note on the inside cover that read, "This is the record of 22 years of one man's work and 20 years of one woman's continuation of it. It began with a horse that nobody wanted. It will not end. It did not end. The bloodline was still running, still documented, still carrying the qualities that a man in Billings had spent a lifetime building, and a woman in Red Hollow Valley had refused to let disappear when Clara Whitmore Cade died in the autumn of 1909 on the ranch that had once been 2 ranches separated by a fence surrounded by horses whose eyes held the same quality of attention that had stopped her at an auction pen 28 years before. She had looked when no one else looked. She had stayed when no one else would have. She had built what no one else believed was there. And she had been right, not eventually, not in retrospect, not once the proof accumulated and the world caught up, but from the very first morning, in the very first moment, when she stood at that fence and looked at a $35 horse that everyone else had already given up on, and knew with the absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who trusted what she saw over what she was told, that what stood before her was not a mistake, and not a charity case, and not a $35 anything. What stood before her was extraordinary. She had always known it, and she never stopped proving it.